Welcome to the Honest Money Show. Thanks to our sponsor Bitteroo for making today's episode possible, Australia's biggest Bitcoin-only exchange. Hi Brad, welcome to Honest Money Show.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I am so glad you said yes to this episode. So I've got your book, Resistance Money here, which is an absolutely wonderful read. I know quite a few people in Australia that quite like this this book. I'm also interested to know, and on behalf of a friend, is the audiobook coming out?
I am told about a month. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. There's a very busy dad who just had his second child and he's very keen to get it in the audio version. So yeah, I'm so happy to hear that. I want to start by talking a little bit more about your book. So in your book, you make a great philosophical case for Bitcoin. It's like essentially the foundation for a more just financial system. Do you want to sort of give a high-level view of what the case is?
Sure. There's two parts to it. So the first part is the framework for how to evaluate Bitcoin. And then the second part is sort of walking through Bitcoin when you're thinking about it in that framework. So the framework is, we thought, so this is a co-written book with Andrew Bailey and Craig Warmke, who are also philosophers. And so much of the discussion around Bitcoin comes from either people who have Bitcoin and thus are incentivized to get other people to have it so that the price will go up. And on the other side, people who don't have Bitcoin and who could have maybe had Bitcoin a long time ago and now are incentivized to have been right all along, and therefore they want the price of Bitcoin to go down, so they turn out to be right. And it's really hard to figure out how to evaluate things that we can literally invest money in. Mm-hmm. And there's an old thought experiment from the 1960s and 70s in philosophy and economics called the veil of ignorance. And that tells us that when we want to evaluate something that we're caught up in, that we're a part of, in this case that we have a financial stake in, what we can do is step behind this veil, and stepping behind the veil makes you forget who you are. So you can still know all the facts about the world. In this case, all the facts about Bitcoin, but all the facts about what governments are looking like, what money looks like in different countries, what the political situations are, etc., the distribution of wealth, all that kind of stuff. So you know all of the facts. The only fact you don't know is which person you are. And then you imagine when I wake up tomorrow morning, I could be any one of these people. There's an equal chance. Would I want to wake up in a Bitcoin world or a non-Bitcoin world? So the world exactly as it is, or the world exactly as it is, but without Bitcoin. And so that's part one, is just setting up that framework and introducing that thought experiment and then letting people decide. But what we also want to do is help people think about what Bitcoin looks like from the perspective of each of these people who they are not. So obviously, if you wake up as Michael Saylor, you'd want Bitcoin to exist. But also, if you wake up as someone who is living in an authoritarian regime and you're on the naughty list of the authorities. They're searching for you, they're blocking your bank account, etc. And similarly, maybe if you're a woman living in a society where you're not allowed to have a bank account, where all your property belongs to your husband or your father. Or and so the list goes on of people who we think would prefer to live in a Bitcoin world than a non-Bitcoin world. And you, from behind the veil, could be any of those people. And once you step back through the veil and you're you shouldn't now forget everything that you learned and say, oh, well, I still don't care. You should think, oh, those are also people. I should care about what life is like for them, and so I should promote Bitcoin. Not necessarily buy, own, even use, but at least think that Bitcoin is good and that the world is better off for having Bitcoin in it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And do you believe that it's not only a matter of holders versus non-holders, but I guess where I'm trying to go is it also about like those who understand versus those who don't understand? Going back to a quote that I heard someone say is education leads to inevitable allocation. So is there an element of people who are anti-Bitcoin just simply not understanding it?
I'm sure there are a lot of people who are against Bitcoin because they don't understand it, or but there are plenty of people who understand some of it. Maybe even understand how the blockchain works. There are computer scientists who are against it. But I think that's because they're not aware of how Bitcoin is being used by the people that I care about, who are, trying to resist authoritarianism. And it's really hard to read the stories of all of these people, to go to the Oslo Freedom Forum that the Human Rights Foundation puts on and hear person after person talk about how they were able to escape political persecution because of Bitcoin, or overthrow a dictator because of Bitcoin, and then in the end say, still, it's bad.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it really matters what someone is exposed to. If you're a police officer who's dealing with crime and you're constantly exposed to, I guess, people using Bitcoin as a tool to commit those crimes, then that's kind of your worldview. That's what you're exposed to. And I can understand why you might be anti-Bitcoin. But I also can see and appreciate that if someone like that did go to the Oslo Forum, that they might, expand that awareness and understanding of what it is.
My neighbor is a police officer, actually. And when I told him, I work on Bitcoin, he said, oh yeah, we're just getting more and more calls from people who are reporting scams where people are trying to extort them from Bitcoin. I just really hate Bitcoin. Because it makes it easier for people to do illegal things. And I said, oh yeah, it totally does. But it also makes it easier for people to do illegal things in countries where what's illegal isn't necessarily wrong. And he said, oh yeah, that's a really good point. I said, not all laws are just laws, even in the US, but especially in other places. And for example, Alexei Navalny, who was fighting against Putin's regime for such a long time, was using Bitcoin to do it. Oh yeah, he said that's really good. So I gave him a copy of the book. We're gonna talk about it at some point. But I think even people who care about their own laws and want to see their own laws followed can really easily see both how other laws are bad and also how our laws aren't guaranteed to stay the way that we want them. It requires constant vigilance, and laws have changed throughout the years. And you might think that people should have a backup in case the laws go south.
Yeah, absolutely. And, my background is I'm ex-Yugoslavia and now live in Australia. And Australia is such a good and stable country that a lot of people here can't imagine it ever turning into something undesirable. But I'm like, I kind of have the life experience that it is possible. It is more than possible. So I'm always like a little bit vigilant and yeah. But I also wanted to speak about, when I started this podcast, obviously I started talking about all the good things about Bitcoin and how it's great and what problems it solves. But it's interestingly, a few people are coming out who don't yet have an allocation, but they are very curious about Bitcoin as a solution to some of the world's problems. And where they're particularly getting hung up on is like, okay, I understand Bitcoin. I understand what a deflationary world might look like. I understand the value proposition for me personally, for the community, for the whole world. But they don't necessarily see the transition between the current world and potentially a hyper Bitcoinized world, and also how that might impact things like government services. So I know that's a very speculative question. And there's a lot to unpack there, but do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, we talk about this in the book, and I think there's a couple of things to be said. So one is the hyper Bitcoinized world where Bitcoin is the only money and is used for everything is by no means guaranteed. That depends on both government action and individual choice. Governments will not stop running their own currencies until nobody is using them. And so that's up to people. People can decide whether they want to keep using the government currency or not. So the other thing to say is I think Bitcoin, whether or not the entire world uses it as money all the time, still serves an important role for now, which is perhaps disciplining some of these central banks or people who are running currencies by letting them know that people have this option, that they can invest in Bitcoin, that they can use Bitcoin as money, that they can accept Bitcoin for their goods and services. And that might make it that any, for example, central bank digital currency has some guaranteed privacy features, because if not, people will use Bitcoin instead. That they can't seize it from people, because if they could, people will use Bitcoin instead, and so on down the line of monetary policies and rules and things like that. If Bitcoin is around as an option, then central banks and people running currencies know that at any point people could use Bitcoin instead, and so they have to incentivize you to use their own currency. Now, one of the ways that that's happening, of course, is taxes. If you live in the U.S., you have to pay taxes in the U.S. dollar. They don't accept Bitcoin. And I think most governments are like that. They only accept their local currency. So that's one kind of incentive, but it might be the case that people just keep all of their money in Bitcoin, use that for and only pay taxes in the local currency. And I'm not sure how long those would last. So I think incentivizes governments and banks to behave more responsibly than they might otherwise have done.
Yeah, yeah, and that is very important because sometimes government spending tends to get out of control. And I'm particularly worried because in the last month alone, both Ray Dalio and Elon Musk have alluded to the debt crisis being a lot sooner than what most people might think. So I think I've read somewhere like 2 to 3 year horizon, which is absolutely scary to think about, and how that will impact the US and the whole world if there is some sort of a debt crisis. Obviously, I've never lived through something like that in my lifetime. I have no idea what to expect. And also, I can only speculate how Bitcoin is going to fit into that picture. I've also read that Russia, for example, is accusing now the US of using Bitcoin and stable coins to manage their debt. So it's wild to think the times that we're living in. If you had asked me 10, 20 years ago if all of these things would be like a topic of discussion, I wouldn't have believed it. I'm very curious to know your students at the university. Do they talk to you about Bitcoin? Is that a thing?
It's really interesting. Most of my students, when I tell them that I work on Bitcoin in a, say, intro to philosophy class or something like that, a good number of them ask me what crypto I think is going to pump next. And I say, I'm just interested in Bitcoin. Well, they all feel like they missed the boat on Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And that's because they no longer are thinking of savings. When I was growing up, I was taught to put away 10% or whatever I could in a savings account, and the savings account would get 4 or 5% a year. And now a savings account gets basically nothing. There's no interest on savings accounts. And the price of things that students would want to save for, like homes, are going up faster than what they can get as returns on any sort of investment. And I think the main reason they're interested in cryptocurrencies is because they think the only hope they have to achieve the American dream is to basically hit the lottery. And crypto is their version of the lottery. It's these pump and dump tokens, and if they can get in at the right time and get out at the right time, then they can make enough money to actually have some sort of net worth. And this idea of slowly and steadily investing in something like Bitcoin or even the S&P 500, they just think is not going to make them ever able to buy a house or to afford to have kids or things like that. And that's really disheartening to me.
Yeah, it breaks my heart that this is how the youth of today feels. I can understand why they do. It is, I'm not that close to the US, but I know in Australia we're definitely experiencing a cost of living crisis, and I can't see it getting better. I can only see it getting worse, if I'm completely honest. And yeah, it's interesting that a lot of people are now disincentivized to even think long term. They want the quick wins. They don't want to. Yeah, it's. I don't. I don't know how to solve for that problem. But I want to know. I'm curious from you. Is how would we navigate the world today into a Bitcoinized world without extreme casualties?
You mean a hyper Bitcoinized world, or I think we live in a Bitcoinized world,
Yeah.
where Bitcoin is now pretty much, no matter where you live, an option for you, and everyone can opt in to Bitcoin. So I guess I haven't really thought all the way through what happens
Yeah.
if or what would need to be the case in order for everyone to opt into Bitcoin. I would guess that would have to be because of some severe monetary and financial unrest, like a debt crisis or something. Otherwise, there are going to be still a large number of people who don't see the need for it. So I can't really see a way that it happens without substantial suffering along the way. So I'm hoping that in some ways, I'm hoping that we don't get to a hyper Bitcoinized world. I hope that we get to a place where governments still have money. They can still use it to help people who need it by, providing food and things like that. And then Bitcoin exists as a way to save.
Yeah. Yeah. So you essentially are hoping for that Bitcoin stays as a store of value rather than a medium of exchange or a unit of account.
As the only medium of exchange or unit of account, I think that would be bad. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange as much as possible, which is not very much due to laws about capital gains. But I know a lot of people who use Bitcoin exclusively as a means of exchange, and I think that's great. But for people to be forced to use it as a medium of exchange means other mediums of exchange have failed. And I think that would be only because of a catastrophe that I would not
Yeah.
want to see happen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'd
Absolutely.
love for more businesses to accept Bitcoin. I'd love for the government to have exemptions for certain amounts of Bitcoin transactions. I'd like to be able to buy groceries and all that sort of stuff with Bitcoin instead. And I'm working towards that future, but that wouldn't even be a hyper Bitcoinist world. That would be a world where still weirdos like us who understand money and things like that can use it, and other people will go along and their lives will be just fine with not having Bitcoin. If we get to a point where everyone in America feels like they need Bitcoin, then I think it will mean something has gone terribly wrong.
Yeah, and that's my fear. That's my fear that there will be some sort of a catastrophic event that will trigger people to need it rather than, being motivated to get into it proactively. It will be a reactive thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see how that would go terribly wrong because it's not the type of thing that you just adopt overnight under duress and under panic. A lot of things can obviously go wrong with self-custody and just the technical understanding of it. So I really hope that that doesn't happen.
We don't encourage anyone in the book to buy Bitcoin, but we do say you should probably know how to use it, maybe experiment with it, so that if it comes to a point where you do need it, perhaps you find yourself on the wrong side of your government or something like that, at least you know how to use it, and you're not gonna you'll know how to transfer your wealth into it, and then you won't lose it by mismanaging your keys or something.
Yeah, that's really important. Do you think there is a role to play with, I guess, the existing Bitcoiners who understand it, helping educate governments, local communities about Bitcoin, not so much the price, but the foundational stuff? Is there a responsibility on us all to do that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Everyone who has taken the leap into understanding Bitcoin themselves should, I think, probably start with whoever's in your sphere of influence. It's much more likely that you're going to be able to help your neighbors and friends and family understand Bitcoin than that you're going to be able to help your prime minister or your president or what have you, or even member of Congress. Also, those people can serve as practice. If you ever do get the opportunity to talk to someone who's in power, you'll have understood where other people's hangups are and the parts that are more difficult to explain. So I think it's really hard once you feel like you understand Bitcoin not to talk about it. You feel like you've made this huge leap in understanding something really important. And once you've made the leap, it's almost hard to imagine how other people haven't. And you think it should just be easy. And that's really interesting how we can forget so easily the mindset that we were in before we found out about it. But the more of the kinds of conversations you have and the more you hear the objections and things like that, I think the easier it is to have more of them. The better you get at explaining it to people.
Yeah. It's so true how easy we forget. I remember when I took ski lessons and the ski instructor admitted that, he's been skiing for 15 years, so he doesn't know what it's like to be a beginner. And I feel like we transition from A to B in a much shorter time frame. Only a year ago or just over a year ago, I thought Bitcoin was a scam. I absolutely didn't care for it. And now I care about it very much.
Yeah, from thinking it's a scam to having a podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. In Australia, we have the Australian Bitcoin Industry Body, and this is like an entirely voluntary organization where we speak to government bodies about Bitcoin and try help inform some of the policies. But we're still so early, Brad. We are so early in Australia. There's only been one politician that has proactively reached out to the body, to the industry body, to speak about Bitcoin. And other than that, it's a few people are talking about it, but not very proactively doing anything. But yeah, I would like to talk about the human rights more. That is something that's dear to my heart. What can you tell us about the human rights aspect from the book?
Well, the first thing that got me interested in Bitcoin was I had a friend who had come back from the summer break that we had during graduate school, and he had just done the whole summer just spent researching Bitcoin, which ended with him like sending off a wire transfer to some random bank in Russia. And he was telling me about it. It's this currency and it lives on the internet and you can send it for like no money. And I had lived in Singapore as a child growing up, and I remembered watching people stand in line to do foreign remittances from, well, like back to the Philippines or back to Bangladesh or things like that. And I knew that it was like 20-25% that these people would pay to send money. Their family members would have to walk, get the money in cash, carry it home, hiding it under their clothes, trying to pretend they didn't just come from the Western Union. And I was like, oh, this will save them so much money. So that was like the first light bulb moment was international remittances. And then the second was shortly after this, reading a story in Time about Time magazine about Roya Mahbub, who had started up a software company in Afghanistan and was hiring women, and women couldn't have bank accounts. They couldn't have money. The women who were working for her were going home and getting the money taken from them. And she started paying them in Bitcoin. So just some small percentage so that their families wouldn't know what was happening. But she wanted to give them sort of financial freedom, the ability to build wealth for themselves. And a lot of them were able to live much more freely after she did that. And so that was really, for me, as much as the first one got me interested, this convinced me of the value of Bitcoin. That when there are people who have authority over you and can dictate how you live your life, it's important to be able to get away from them. But if you don't have anything, you don't ever think that you can do that. You think that your options are, you think that you don't have options. So for a whole lot of people around the world, now this can work with husbands or fathers, it can also work with governments or bosses. A lot of people think that they're beholden to someone or some group of people, and they can't imagine their life changing. But having access to Bitcoin and being able to build wealth in a way that's private, that nobody knows about, that nobody can take from you, I think is really important for them and yeah.
Yeah, and obviously love hearing those stories. You've just inspired me to travel to Oslo to listen in on these stories. Um, and I'm distracted by the Hamilton poster and behind you as well. I absolutely love the play.
I was listening to that before we started recording.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's one of my favorite soundtracks. Sometimes I listen to it when I'm in the gym because yeah, and also it just somehow also reminds me weirdly of Bitcoin, but that's just I guess a me thing. Um,
Well, Alexander Hamilton started the National Bank of the United States, so there's a lot of overlap.
yeah, but you being a professor at University of Wyoming, I'm more interested as well to understand the young people's mindset and perspective when it comes to Bitcoin. What are some of is there another entry point into their curiosity other than just the price?
Yes. So I mentioned that one group just asked me about these pump and dump tokens because they view it as a slot machine. But then there's a sizable group who have grown up. I mean, they've now all grown up understanding that there's really no privacy on the internet, that your ISP is tracking what you visit, and there's cookies on every website, and your data is a very valuable commodity that is collected and bought and sold and traded and things like that. And they know that every purchase they make with a credit card or using their bank account online is tracked and correlated and things like that. So they've grown up thinking this is part of life. It's impossible to get away from these violations of privacy. And they basically think that they don't have privacy anymore, that it's nearly impossible to get if you want to live a somewhat normal life. Now, right now, using Bitcoin means not living a somewhat normal life, because it's really hard to find places to spend Bitcoin, and still a lot of places you have to enter your address and things like that. But I explained to them that with Bitcoin, your name is not associated with your Bitcoin address. And there's no way for someone to look at the Bitcoin blockchain and figure out which transactions are yours. Now, that's less true than it was when I first started saying this to them, because there are now firms that specialize in that. But for most of my students, nobody's ever going to dedicate the computing resources that it would take to do the kind of blockchain analytics that would enable companies or governments to figure out who they are. Right? This is trivially easy for credit card companies to do. It takes absolutely no effort. It takes a lot of effort in the case of Bitcoin. So it's not a guarantee of privacy using Bitcoin, but it's pretty good. And for people like them, it will almost certainly be the case that their Bitcoin transactions will never be linked to them. And that's a really valuable thing, I think, on today's internet, where it's really hard to find that level of privacy. They also have grown up learning about people being cut off from financial services. And none of them have, at least I haven't had a student come up to me ever and say, I was debanked, or Visa wouldn't let my transactions go through or something. But they know about marijuana companies who've been forced to hide all of their cash in massive safes in the basement because no bank will take them on. And they're aware of Visa and PayPal and Venmo and these other providers blocking transactions from certain places or about certain topics. And so they understand the value of a currency where nobody can block transactions. Nobody can prevent you from sending Bitcoin to someone else. No one can prevent you from receiving it. That's a novel thing for them, but they see the importance of it. So yeah, for most of them, I actually approach Bitcoin not as a store of value, but as a medium of exchange, and through the lens of financial privacy. You thought, I'll say to them, that it was impossible to have any privacy anymore on the internet. But it turns out that it is, and it's because of Bitcoin.
Start saving in Bitcoin with Bitaroo, Australia's biggest Bitcoin-only exchange. Bitaroo offers easy tools and advanced features. Join thousands of happy users making their first Bitcoin purchase today. Download the app or visit bitaroo.com.au. Yeah, and I'm very curious to know is when you talk about the medium of exchange and the pseudonymous nature of Bitcoin with your students, do you have some students asking, I guess bigger questions and having alarms going off in their head about, well, if that's the case, how would people pay tax hypothetically, if it can't be tracked by governments? I can see that being a concern for many people.
Yeah. Not just, so they'll ask about that. Well, how do you effectively tax a population that's using a private money? Also, how do you effectively enforce sanctions on countries if they can just turn to Bitcoin? How do you effectively track arms sales or human trafficking, things like that, if they can use Bitcoin? So those are, I think, they require three really distinct answers. So in the second case, with sanctions, you basically can't enforce small-scale sanction. You can't sanction entities from spending small amounts of Bitcoin. But at the level of, say, Russian oligarchs, it's really hard to transfer $1 billion of wealth into Bitcoin as an individual these days without people noticing. So that's one way of responding to this idea that major drug organizations or crime syndicates or oligarchs or things like that will just use Bitcoin instead. Mm-hmm. It's really impractical at the levels that they need. Maybe that won't be the case. When I first started saying this, the market cap of Bitcoin was, 10% of what it is now or less. So the bigger that gets, the easier it is for them. In response to the human trafficking and drugs and things like that, I think there's two responses. One is we've actually seen a lot of those be tracked and people be associated with their Bitcoin transactions because governments dedicate significant computing resources to doing that. And the other response is that people already have a vehicle for doing that works far better than Bitcoin, that doesn't have a blockchain that's an immutable record of all the transactions. And that's just physical cash. US $100 bills are by far the most used currency for drugs and human trafficking and arms deals. And I remember learning at some point that 95% of US $100 bills had traces of cocaine on them. And I remember being shocked by this. But it makes perfect sense. Physical cash it's bulky and it's heavy, but it's untraceable. And unless you're there to see the transaction, there's no traces of it left in the world. We can still go back to the very first Bitcoin transactions and see them on the blockchain and run analytics. And so it's a really bad idea if you want to transact large amounts privately to do that. And then in terms of taxes, you can do the same thing. I mean, people get paid under the table in cash, and governments can't really tax that either. So I don't think Bitcoin. One of the things we try to show in the book is that Bitcoin privacy is very similar to cash privacy. And if you're okay with cash, which you should be because we've been using it for thousands of years, then you should be okay with Bitcoin. And yes, you're not gonna be able to do the same kinds of things as a government that you can do with digital money on people's apps. But that's good. We should support that. People should be able to have privacy, and then we trust them to pay their taxes like they're supposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think there's a lot to be said about the incentives. A lot of people don't actually have the incentives to have a large stash of Bitcoin that is not somehow traceable, because eventually everyone wants to potentially utilize their Bitcoin for something in the future, whether it's buying a house, whether it's taking a holiday with your family. So you don't want to just all of a sudden have a large sum of money that you can't explain where it came from. So I'm personally not too concerned about that. But let's talk a little bit about Bitcoin culture. What is the Bitcoin culture in your local community?
It's interesting. I get a lot of people passing through who want to talk about Bitcoin. They've heard about the Bitcoin Research Institute, or they've read the book or heard me on a podcast or something. And I just had a guy pop into my office last week. So it was the first week of classes, and I thought he was a faculty member or something like that. And he said, "Oh, I'm moving from somewhere on the East Coast to San Francisco to work on Bitcoin." And I was driving down the highway and I saw signs for Laramie, and I thought of you. The culture within Laramie is not what it is, I think, in Nashville or San Francisco. We don't have a central meeting place that draws people in. But there are businesses that accept Bitcoin. We have a Center for Blockchain and Digital Innovation on campus as well that has a few Bitcoiners. I think students are being drawn into this idea that Bitcoin is interesting and perhaps potentially important to the future, and maybe they should learn about it.
Yeah. And is there an appetite from the university to offer Bitcoin courses?
The university will offer whatever courses will fill up for the most part. So we're given quite a bit of autonomy in what we want to teach, as long as we can get enough students to take the class. I encountered no resistance at all when I went from researching metaphysics and philosophy of religion to researching Bitcoin. And I was a little surprised, but really happy about that. One of the things that tenure gives you is the freedom to explore potentially fruitless, but potentially very fruitful areas. And so once I got tenure, I could kind of do whatever I wanted. And I think they've seen how good that has been for me and for the department and the university. So that's been pretty cool to see.
Yeah. Yeah. And Brad, what is your role at the Bitcoin Research Institute?
We launched the Bitcoin Research Institute, or I launched the Bitcoin Research Institute maybe 2 months ago. And so we announced it a year ago, and it took a year for the academic bureaucratic wheels to grind through. But the institute exists to produce academic research on Bitcoin. One of the problems is that Bitcoin, even though it to many people feels like it's relatively new, in terms of like developments and interesting new things, a lot of academic researchers are drawn to the cryptocurrency networks that can do more things, that you can build more stuff on, and that also have more complexity and are easier to break. So there's not a whole lot of academic research that's done on Bitcoin outside of things like price prediction. So I get a Google Scholar email every day that tells me the new papers that are published on Bitcoin. And almost all of them are some sort of price modeling. And I think that's just about the least interesting thing in Bitcoin. The price is going to do whatever it's going to do, and that's based on whether people want it. But people want it based on other things. So I wanted to build a place where people who were interested in Bitcoin but couldn't quite see how it would fit into their academic research could get together and talk about it, get feedback, build a community, develop projects together. So that's what I'm doing here so I'm the director of the institute, and I see my role as mostly a facilitator. I'm trying to identify people who are working on Bitcoin in places scattered throughout the world and bring them together to have conversations and build collaborative projects together.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I actually have come across some academic research, and I can tell you about that after the podcast. But it isn't price related. Some of it is, but I think some of it is also like related to energy consumption or adoption. Yeah. So, is there a particular area that you might be interested from, like an academic standpoint, of what kind of research you personally would like to see coming out?
I think a lot of it depends on what the prevailing discussion about Bitcoin is in the wider culture. So one of the reasons to do this is that I think people, when they hear about Bitcoin, don't quite know where to go. And they'll often hear about it from news media. When news media wants to write about Bitcoin, they don't know who to trust. And as I mentioned with individuals, there's all these people with incentives to tell you the truth, to say Bitcoin is good, say Bitcoin is bad. And so they tend to lean on academic research, thinking that academic research is going to be the thing that's most likely to be neutral and unbiased and fair. And I think by and large, that's true. Unfortunately, Bitcoin is very complicated and difficult to understand. And a lot of the scholarship that's been done about Bitcoin has been done by people who don't really understand all of the moving parts and the complexity of the blockchain and the energy use and the market price and miners and nodes and all these sorts of things. So in addition to producing academic research on Bitcoin and bringing people together to do that, I also want to help vet the research of people who are writing papers about Bitcoin, but kind of know that they don't know enough about it, and to sort of help them with that. So for a long time, it was stuff about criminal behavior. Then for a long time, it was mining. People were really worried about the amount of energy Bitcoin was using. for a really short time, it was hardware device obscurity. So the miners don't last very long, and then they go to landfills, and isn't that terrible? We're filling up landfills with Bitcoin miners. And so the public conversations change, and you never know quite where it's going to go next. So I don't really know where it's going to go, and therefore I want to have academic research about everything. And it's been one of the things that's been cool is getting emails from people who have heard me talk about it at some point on some podcast or something, and say, I'm a tourism professor, and I also am interested in Bitcoin. What projects could I do about Bitcoin and tourism? I was thinking like token something or other. And I said, well, what about Bitcoin circular economies, and looking at places like that and how much revenue they take in versus nearby locations that have many of the similar features but don't accept Bitcoin. Does accepting Bitcoin and getting, like, what's the level of local merchant adoption that's needed to actually attract people to fly across the world to your place instead of somewhere else because you have Bitcoin? I talked to a marketing professor at the Bitcoin Policy Summit who has historically, done work on other things, but is now interested in Bitcoin and wants to figure out a Bitcoin marketing project. Political science, what's the makeup of Bitcoin owners? Do they tend to have a certain demographic profile? One of the things we're finding from a whole lot of surveys, which costs a lot of money to do, is that Bitcoiners look very much like the average person. They're not particularly politically one direction or the other. They do tend to skew more male and younger. And they tend to skew, at least in the US, tend to be more racial minorities. So the percentage of Black and Latino Bitcoin owners is higher than the percentage of white owners. So that just interesting things like that. I'm always wanting to, anything that's not about Bitcoin price, I'm interested in.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in that as well. I would love to know more about, like, specifically the demographics of people who hold Bitcoin. I know there were 2 research papers done. I don't want to quote where. I think one was the US and one could have even potentially been Australia. But regardless of that, it was done on people who own crypto. So it was broad, it wasn't just Bitcoin, and how they score higher in the dark tetrad personalities. And I looked at this research paper. Again, there was no distinction made between Bitcoin and other forms of currencies. I think there was definitely a bit of a bias in the way that the study was formulated, and also the correlation coefficient wasn't that strong. So I was like, there was all these news articles that came out supporting it, but looking at the study, I'm like, it's kind of a bit meh. But I would love to see more studies, academic studies done in that, because that's kind of what I'm always interested in, the people side of things.
Two things that I've learned is, one, it's really hard to ask exactly the right questions to figure these sorts of things out. So you can ask people, for example, do you own Bitcoin? And a lot of people who don't own Bitcoin will say yes, because they own Ethereum or they own some other thing. And they don't even know enough about Bitcoin to know that it's different from these other sorts of things. So the way that you word questions in order to get answers is really important, and takes well-trained sociologists and political scientists and people who are used to crafting these kinds of questions to know where people are likely to misinterpret it and somehow correct for that. And then number 2, people jump all over the academic research that confirms their biases. And so if you see a research paper that says Bitcoin owners largely reflect normal, like standard demographics, that's not very interesting. If you get Bitcoin owners have dark tetrad personality traits, ooh, that's interesting. And that's what we wanted. We wanted Bitcoin owners to be these shadowy supercoders.
Psychopaths.
Yeah. So that's going to get a lot more traction, even if it turns out not to be true. And I think that's what happened with, back in the day, this Bitcoin mining paper that went viral for a while. It was being cited everywhere on the likelihood that Bitcoin would raise global emissions and thus raise the temperature of the planet 1.9 degrees Celsius within 5 years. And it was based on a lot of misunderstandings of Bitcoin, like not knowing that there was a difficulty adjustment, not knowing that blocks, had to come every 10 minutes. You couldn't get faster and faster blocks, etc. So it is, we can put out as much academic research that's correct and accurate as we want, but it might still be the case that people seize on the bad academic research because that's what they want to be true. And I'm not sure how to change that.
And you possibly can't.
Maybe not. Yeah.
You can only do what you can do.
But the more that everyone's friends and neighbors are the ones who own Bitcoin, the less sort of mysterious and bad it seems. If that's a part of everyone's portfolio, 2% or 1% or whatever, it sort of demystifies the whole thing in a way that I think is good.
Yeah, if we can just de-weird Bitcoin a little bit, that would be great. So it doesn't become this dirty thing to talk about. It's something we can all, have a conversation about. But I'm curious, I kind of asked you this, but I want to ask you the same thing, but from a different angle, is obviously there's still a lot of FUD about Bitcoin and a lot of misconceptions, and some things, might have some merit, but are grossly misrepresented. So is there any particular area or persistent myths that you think need more research right now?
There are some things that, if true, would be, I think, bad for Bitcoin, but we don't have nearly enough evidence of their truth. And in some cases, we have evidence that they're not true. So I think especially around Bitcoin mining, there's this question of how much energy Bitcoin mining is using. And the early FUD, so FUD for those who don't know is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. The early FUD around Bitcoin mining was just the number. The number was bad all on its own. Bitcoin is using as much electricity as the Netherlands or Sweden or whatever. And that was just bad by itself. Then it got more sophisticated. Not only is Bitcoin doing that, but it's using carbon and things like that. And it's pricing out people. So energy in certain parts of, in my case, the US, is getting more expensive because of Bitcoin mining. So it got more and more sophisticated, the objections to Bitcoin along the lines of energy usage. And if true, some of those things would be bad. If it was really stealing the energy from, people who needed to heat their homes, that would be terrible. And I wouldn't like that. I think there's not necessarily academic research, but reporting that shows that that's not happening, that it is too expensive. The Bitcoin mining is too competitive an industry to pay market rates for energy in most countries in the world. So what's happening is that Bitcoin mining is doing one of two things. Either it's chasing non-rivalrous energy that exists in the world but couldn't be used for anything else because it's too far away or something like that. Or Bitcoin miners are cutting deals with energy providers to take the excesses. And this is what's happening in Texas, for example. Bitcoin miners have a deal that they'll purchase a certain amount of extra energy from the grid if needed at low rates. And then when the grid is being taxed because there's a weather event, then they'll turn off the miners. They can't compete with people who need to, in Texas, in the middle of summer, use it for air conditioning. We're willing to pay a lot more to be comfortable, and they're having to compete with miners across the world, many of whom are getting free energy. So they're not going to pay that much. So there is academic research being done on this. I know Margot Paez, who's at, I believe, the Georgia Institute of Technology, is doing her PhD work specifically looking at Bitcoin mining corporations. But there's also a lot of people just from the industry who are telling us how much hash rate they're contributing to the Bitcoin network and where the energy is coming from. I met someone from who's working on this massive dam in Paraguay. They're having to sell that. Paraguay can't use as much energy as the dam's producing. They're having to sell most of it to Brazil, and they want to start mining Bitcoin with it. I talked to a guy who's going around villages in Kenya that have hydroelectric power and setting up power stations to harness the river and paying off the construction by mining Bitcoin with it, and then also providing homes with power. That's really cool. And
Yeah.
hundreds of Kenyan villages that didn't have electricity now have electricity because of Bitcoin mining. And he makes this point regularly. He's like, I'm helping so many people that everyone thinks it's a charity. But I'm making money. This is a profitable enterprise. And I could have 100 competitors here and still make money. People should come do this with me. We can electrify Kenya and much of the rest of Africa while being profitable. So I'd like to see more academic research done in these areas too.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are such feel-good stories. I love it. I love it. Do you guys have are you going to send out a newsletter?
That is on the agenda. Yeah. So we hired one of my co-authors on the book, Andrew Bailey. We hired him to start this fall, and he and I were supposed to do a lot of that together. He is unable to move here until next year. So while I'm running things on my own, a newsletter is not in the cards. But hopefully starting next year, when there's two of us here, then that'll be one of the early things that we'll want to get started on.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah, do you have any final thoughts or messages that you'd like to share?
I think the main takeaway is that everyone evaluates Bitcoin from their own perspective. And I think it's just really important to remember that you are one of 8 billion people in the world, and the vast majority of people live lives that don't look anything like your life. And try to figure out when you're evaluating things like Bitcoin, that's a global thing, how they might use it, and pay attention to them. And for a lot of them, you can actually find out stories of how people in other countries who live lives very differently than yours are using Bitcoin. And so that's important to keep in mind as you're thinking through what you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Love it. Such a powerful message. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week on The Honest Money Show. Big thanks to Bitteroo. Check out why more Aussies are choosing them at bitteroo.com.au. And shout out to our listeners on Fountain, where you can earn sats just by tuning in. If you appreciate the way we cut through the noise, you can support us directly via the QR code in the episode notes. Until next week, take care of yourself and your money.